Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
And we're back! Season 4 is coming in hot with some great guests and some more interesting formats. I have some special episodes coming up like the Meat Eating Heroes panel that we filmed for Food Lies with Mark Sisson, Dr. Sean Baker, and Dr. Paul Saladino. I also put together a compilation episode that is 6 months in the making with amazing stories from people around America using nutrient-dense diets to change their life. What is a nutrient-dense diet, you may be asking, and who am I? The podcast is growing by the day, and I want to give new listeners a quick overview. If you're not new, be sure to stick around. There's a special event announcement at the end. I'm Brian Sanders, and I'm creating the feature-length documentary Food Lies, which covers the entire story on what humans should be eating, including an evolutionary history, where we went wrong in the last 60 years, and how we can do this sustainably. We're in the process of editing now, and they're shooting some of the last segments in Canada in July. We don't have a release date yet, unfortunately. After years of studying different diets and eating strategies, I've landed on what we're calling the sapien diet, or way of eating, or lifestyle. Because it's not a diet. It's a nutrient-dense way to eat for life. I believe you can even dip into non-ideal foods on the weekends or at a special event once you hit your goal weight and if it doesn't interfere with food intolerances or restrictions. The sapien diet is based on 3 simple pillars. Number 1, nutrient-dense whole foods. This means mostly animal foods, which are the most nutrient-dense and have the most bioavailable nutrients. This means eating nose to tail and including foods like liver, bone marrow or broth, grass-fed butter or tallow, eggs, cold water fish like salmon and sardines, oysters and other mollusks, fermented vegetables, and low-sugar fruits like avocados and olives. Number 2, for each meal, focus on protein, embrace fat, and minimize carbs. The animal protein should be the base of each meal, but make sure it comes with enough fat and don't be scared of it. Most carbs are nutrient poor and really don't provide much to you other than getting in the way of your body burning the fat from your meal, or better yet, from your body. And the last pillar is 3, don't eat all the time. You could call this a condensed eating window or intermittent fasting. Try to eat within an 8 to 10 hour window each day and let your body rest from constantly having to digest food. There's a lot more to this, so please listen back from episode 1. Check out sapien.org/diet. That's sapien.org/diet. And we'll continue to put out more details on the Sapien framework in the future. Okay, so now on to this episode. I'm starting off the new season with a bang. Maybe you haven't heard of Keith Baar. You should have. I hope to get some of these researchers doing groundbreaking and valuable work into the spotlight. Keith is a brilliant researcher who has done great work in his career and published a ton of papers. Much of his work is around mTor, muscle protein synthesis, aka building muscle, collagen synthesis, aka building all the other tissues that are so important in your body, and so much more. He's a professor of Molecular Exercise Physiology at UC Davis and works in the Department of Neurobiology, Physiology and Behavior, College of Biological Sciences, and the Department of Physiology and Membrane Biology, School of Medicine. He has a bachelor's degree in Kinesiology from the University of Michigan, a master's in Human Biodynamics from UC Berkeley, and a PhD in Physiology and Biophysics from the University of Illinois. You'll learn a ton about how to live long and live strong. He only goes to the gym for about 10 to 12 minutes 2 times per week, yet is still getting stronger each year. We talk about how to live a long, healthy life and if eating too much meat is going to help or hurt that. I love talking about the benefits of eating meat so much that I started a grass-fed meat company called Nose to Tail, which can be found at nosetotale.org. We ship nutrient-dense boxes of meat to all 48 contiguous U.S. states. We have ground beef with liver, kidney, heart, and spleen mixed in, so you get all the nutrients and none of the hassle and barely any of the livery taste. We have so many other things like bone broth, marrow bones, tallow, suet, and all the normal cuts as well. You can also support my work at patreon.com/peakhuman. This is where we keep the podcast ad-free, so I don't have to take anyone else's money to talk about or be influenced by their products. This is also where you get the amazing extended show notes put together by Christy with all the studies and further details included. This is valuable stuff. I'd say better than most nutrition colleges. Definitely better than most nutrition programs teaching all this whole grain nonsense actually. And of course, the Food Lies film is still on Indiegogo and needs support. We're desperately trying to finish it. Check out the Eat Meat shirts there. They're a great way to let people know they can't blame the steak for what the fries did. And one more big thing, we're having some incredible events in Toronto on Saturday, July 13th and Friday, July 19th. We'll be having a Food Lies special supporters luncheon at North America's only meat sommelier's restaurant, Spaducci. That's right, he's a meat sommelier. They will be serving all-you-can-eat platters of their famous cured meats, Spaducci meat kebabs, as well as lamb chops, cheeses, and wine. This is going to be a tremendous event with special guests of honor Michaela Peterson, Peak Human Episode 18, Tara Couture from Slow Down Farmstead on Instagram, Peak Human Episode 26, and sustainable farmer and speaker Brian Gilvesy, each who will say a few words, and I'll be there as well with some of the Food Lies and Sapien team. Would love to see all you beautiful people there in Toronto. Get your tickets on nosetotail.org/event or click through the show notes. We'll have another casual one of these in San Diego on July 25th. And comment on this podcast post on Instagram if you'd like to have an event in your city. Thanks, everyone. Here's Keith Baar, PhD. All right. Well, we have Keith Baar here. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. No, it's great to be here.
Yeah, well, I've been listening to a lot of stuff and reading about you and your work and think it's awesome. I have so many questions. You're a professor at UC Davis and you work in a lab and you used to be the assistant coach of the strength and conditioning program for the Michigan football team. What's kind of, is that covered or what's your background?
Yeah, so I started as a strength and conditioning coach. I was an athlete, was good at a lot of things, great at nothing. Those are the people who tend to become coaches. That was basically a lot of how I started, and then try to figure out a lot of the questions that were surrounding that some of the things that I was seeing both in the athletes I was working with and myself as to what was driving muscle to get bigger and stronger was a question that I was really focused on. There was lots of kind of work done in people to see, all right, if we lift this way or that way, but there wasn't really much known at a really basic level. So at the molecular level, as to which molecules were turned on when you did different types of exercise, and that was really what I was interested in. And so my PhD was in what molecules were turned on by resistance exercise. There we had discovered that mTOR was activated by exercise, and the activity that you got from the mTOR after exercise correlated really well with how much bigger your muscles were going to get following training. So that was the first bit. And then I went and worked with John Hollisey, who is the father of endurance exercise research. And with him, I looked and found some of the molecules that were activated by endurance exercise, specifically a molecule called PGC1 alpha that's important in mitochondrial health and how many mitochondria that you have in your muscles. That was the basis for a lot of what we were doing at the time, just trying to find how muscle responded to exercise. Nutrition became more and more of a part that we would use. And then as I started aging myself, of course, I started adding aging into some of these things now.
Yeah. So mTOR kind of affects all of these things, leading researcher on this kind of stuff. And I thought it was really interesting that you found that athletes had different response to the same exercise program.
Yeah, so that was something that I'd always seen just as a strength coach, is you put a bunch of different athletes onto a similar strength training program, and some of them got really big, others didn't really change their size very much, and some of them got a really big strength response, and others, they might get bigger, but they didn't get as strong. So all of these really cool things that you see in populations who are trying to maximize their performance or their size or their strength, it really can inform you at a very, very basic level as to what's driving the adaptation. And so you see these big differences in people that if we put a big group of people on the strength training protocol, fully 20 to 30% of them aren't going to increase their muscle mass very much. And then a fully 20 to 30% on the other end are going to have this huge response in a short period of time. For us, that's really fascinating at a mechanistic level as to why people respond differently to really the same type of intervention.
And what did you find?
So our group hasn't done too much in this area as far as strength. There's another group that has. Stu Phillips has done a little bit of this together with a professor named Jamie Timmons. And what they were doing is they were looking for things that could predict or things that you would see in people that would make them either responders or non-responders. And some of the genes that they identified weren't actually genes that, as we classically think about them. So classically, what you think is that we all have this DNA that tells us what we're going to look like and what we're going to be. And the way that it works is normally you take the DNA and you make it into a message, and you make that message into this protein that functions within your muscles or other cells in your body. And what they found is that there was a different kind of messages that you made. They weren't the messages that would go on to make a protein, but they were these small little things that are called microRNAs. And what a microRNA does is it regulates how much protein you make from other RNAs. And one of the things that they found is, sure enough, that people who were non-responders had microRNAs that targeted the mTOR pathway. So they would decrease the activity of mTOR in a different way than people who would respond really well. And so what you would find is this pathway came up again as being, there were genetic ways that each individual, same stimulus, each individual is going to respond differently, partially because some of the people in the population have what we have since termed molecular breaks. And what this means is that, some people, they're driving their car, there's no resistance, they're just driving their car. Those people who don't grow their muscles as much, it's like they're trying to drive around and they've got the parking brake on. You can still do it, but it takes a whole lot more gas in order to drive your car around when you have the parking brake on. So in certain people, they have more of these molecular breaks than other people. And as a result, it's harder for them to build muscle mass and strength.
Interesting. Is there a way around it for those people? I mean, I know there's some other things that you looked into concerning, leucine-rich protein and different foods and diets. But yeah, what else can they do? Or what can generally people do to build muscle?
That's a great question. So the research has become very clear in the last few years that if you want to build muscle, you need to exercise the muscle until it reaches failure. And what that is that's when, if you're lifting a weight, you can't possibly lift the weight again. So you're going as hard as you can, and you go to positive failure when you can't do another repetition. You can't push the weight anymore. You can't pull it. You can't move the weight anymore. Failure is important because that's the only time as people that we use all of the muscle fibers within a given muscle. So what we would normally do is we normally only use enough muscle fibers to produce the movement. And so if we're just going to work and we're not going to go to failure, not all of our muscle fibers get the signal they need to get bigger and stronger. It's only when you get to failure that you recruit every single muscle fiber within a motor unit or within a muscle. And that's the stimulus we need to get a muscle bigger. And then, yes, the leucine-rich protein also works to do that. The interesting thing, again, as we talk about these people who are non-responders, is the way that leucine-rich protein works is it also activates mTOR. And so if you're the non-responders and you have those little molecular breaks that are stopping you from turning on mTOR when you lift weights, they're not letting you turn on mTOR as much from what you eat. And so we all know people. I have a student who said it best when he said, there's some people who are born with abs. They're born and you can just see their ab muscles. You can see they look at a weight, they go past the weight room, they look in, they start building muscle mass. We all know those people. And those are the people who, they don't have any of the breaks. And then we know people who work super hard. They're always in the gym. They're always trying this. They're always doing everything. And they just can't build their muscle mass at all. And so what we're trying to figure out if we can come up with ways, now that we've identified probably 4 or 5 of these molecular breaks, can we identify ways that we can go around them and build our muscle even when the brakes are on? Or can we find ways that we can take the brakes off? And so some of our work that we haven't yet published, we've looked at one specific break, and we can get past that specific break. And so that's really exciting because for us, what it's done is it's taken the same exercise stimulus, and just by putting in things that we know inhibit the protein that we know is one of the molecular breaks, what we've been able to do in animals is we've been able to take normal muscle hypertrophy where the fibers are increasing maybe 10%, over a period of time, without changing the loading, we can get those same muscle fibers to grow on average 65%. So fully
Wow.
six times more just by removing the molecular brake and getting more of this increase in muscle protein synthesis and increase in muscle fiber size. So there are things that are coming that are still being developed. We hope are going to be things that drive people who have a history of not being able to grow muscle, that will be able to do that both in young people and in older people, because in humans, the number one best predictor of longevity seems to be your strength and your muscle mass. So if we can grow your muscle mass and keep your muscle mass as you're older, we should be able to improve your ability to, improve your longevity.
Absolutely. I want to get into that more later, but I want to go back. Well, for one, this sounds like amazing research, and it sounds like a billion-dollar idea. Everyone wants to get stronger. It's like this something that's not a steroid, I guess. I want to go back to the going to failure. That's huge to me. Luckily, I figured this out a couple years ago and have started implementing it in my resistance training, is going to failure. I don't think a lot of people know about this. A lot of people, they're just like, oh, well, I do 10 push-ups and then I go do this and, that's it. It's like, oh, I just go to 10. That's my thing. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the research here is pretty clear that if you just want to get a strong muscle, you have to lift a really heavy weight, because the strength is proportional to the weight you lift. So if you're lifting a heavy weight, you get neural adaptations, you get muscle adaptations, and you get an increase in the ability to transmit force within the muscle. All of those things make you stronger. But if your primary thing is to get a bigger muscle, you don't need to lift a heavy weight. And there's beautiful work out of Stu Phillips' laboratory in Canada, where what he did is he took people and he had them lift 30% of their maximal lift, and he had them do 90% of their maximal lift. And obviously, we have all been trained to think, oh, you got to lift a heavy weight if you're going to increase muscle mass. And what he showed is that if he lifted, and he had these people lift 90% of their maximum, and they would go until they couldn't lift it anymore, and say that was 6 repetitions. Then what he did is he had people do 30%, and he had them go so that they matched the amount of work. So work is the weight times the distance moved. So it's the work. So work is weight and repetitions. So if you did 90% for 6 repetitions, the same amount of work would be done if you did that 30% and you did 18 repetitions.
Yeah.
That's work matched. And when you did that, sure enough, the ones who lifted 30%, they didn't have as much protein synthesis and they weren't going to build their muscle as much. But then what he did is he added a third group where he had them lift the same 30%, but he had them go until they couldn't lift the weight anymore. So they kept going. And this is the embarrassing group to be in the experiment, because, if you're in the gym and you're lifting a heavy weight, yeah, that's great. Everybody feels good about that. But if you're lifting a really light weight, but your arms are shaking and you can't lift it anymore, that's really embarrassing. So that's the group that nobody wanted to be in. But when you did that, when you lifted your little tiny weight, but you lifted it until you couldn't possibly lift it another time, it wasn't 18 repetitions. It was more like 30 repetitions or something like that. But when you got to failure, response in the muscle as far as protein synthesis, exactly the same as when you lifted 90%. And when they did a second study where they trained them for weeks and weeks, the ones who did 30% to failure grew their muscles just as big as the ones who did 80% or 90% of their maximum weight to failure. So all you needed to do, it's not about lifting the heavy weight to get the muscle bigger. Your muscle will grow in response to any weight lifted as long as you go until failure. And so that's when you're applying that load across all the different muscle fibers. And so if you are worried about lifting weights because you have a history of joint problems or other things, now what you can do is, all right, if I lift this weight, but I do lots of volume, so I do either lots of repetitions or lots of sets, now what I can do is I'm going to get this effect where I'm going to build my muscle mass. And that's really what a lot of people want to do.
That's so cool. And is there an optimum version? I don't know if it's been studied or if you have a theory about it of combining those two. Is there any way to go above and beyond those two cases and say do 70% weight and then go do that till failure?
Yeah, so this actually all goes back to when I was a strength coach, because at the time, Michigan was quite unique because our strength coach was a Hall of Fame and strength coach by the name of Mike Gittleson. And Gittleson had been part of this small group of people. So Gittleson had a master's in muscle physiology. So he had that background. And what he did in his small group, they invented something called high intensity training. So this was this idea that you go at a high percentage of your max and you do one set and you go to momentary muscular failure. And what that was you'd lift your heavy weight, you'd do as much as you could. When you couldn't lift it anymore, you'd have a coach who lifts it for you. And then that's when you reached positive failure. You couldn't possibly lift it anymore. And that's what the research has been done. But what they've figured is that, well, we can even get more motor unit activation. We can get you to activate your muscle even more if we have you do negatives, which is resisting the weight as you lower it. And what they found is that if they did that in one set, they could get both an increase in size, but also an increase in strength. Because to increase strength, you need to lift a heavy weight. To increase size, you need to go to failure. And what you can do is you can lift the heavy weight and go to failure, and you can get both adaptations. And what they realized, and what everybody has done scientifically since then, is that if you can get to failure in one set is just as good at building muscle mass and strength as if you did multiple sets, 2 or 3 or 4.
So what if you go to failure, but then you also do it for multiple sets?
So it's really, really hard to do that, just because if you're truly at failure, you're not going to be able to lift much weight on that muscle for much longer than a 2 to 3 or 5 minute wait between sets. So what we do is, instead of doing that, what we do is we use a principle of strength training where you go from an isolated exercise to a compound exercise. What that means is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my isolation exercises that only move one joint. So like a chest fly, I'm only moving my shoulder joint. And so what it does is it isolates the chest muscle. And if I want to get more failure or more fatigue on my chest muscle, what I'm then going to do is going to use a compound movement where I'm going to use like a press, where now I'm using my tricep and my anterior shoulder to help further fatigue my pec muscle. So you can do it, but it's not by doing, it's when you go heavy and you go to failure. If you want to get a bigger stimulus on that muscle, what you would then do is use other muscles to help get it even further fatigued. Because that you can't do the same movement over and over, because if you're really at failure, you can't really produce much. But if I now bring in other muscles that were rested, now I can use those muscles to get a greater stimulus on the muscle that I'm trying to target.
What about like drop sets? I'm a fan of that. It sounds like kind of like if someone's spotting you, like you said, if you go to failure and then this coach helps you do more. Well, I have a weight vest for one thing and can do like pull-ups, and then I'll take till failure, then take the weight vest off and do more till failure.
Right, exactly. And so all you're doing there is you're trying to combine the two things. You're trying to combine the heavy weight to get the stimulus for strength with the failure. And if you go at a heavy enough weight, you're going to do so few repetitions, your muscle won't actually have classically reached failure. Just because if you do it enough weight, you're going to either break down on your neural drive, you're going to break down in some other area, rather than the muscle actually getting to really failure. And drop sets are a good way to do it when you don't have a coach or a spotter. Because what you do is you do a heavy weight, you lift it as many times as you can, and then you just take off some weight and you keep going and keep doing that until you get to that point where you can't even lift a light weight anymore. And that's another way to get to failure. And that's the way that a lot of bodybuilders have done it for years.
Yeah, it's huge. Or just an example too. If you're doing curls, you can just keep grabbing smaller dumbbells until you look like a wimp on the 10-pounders and barely do them. So.
But as we said, if you want to build the muscle, you have to get to the point where you don't have that stimulus anymore.
Okay. And then one more kind of thing that I've been working with. So I go to failure, but then I'll do different exercises and then come back again. So I do have enough rest period. Is that work so you can do 3 sets, but you got that rest time working other muscle groups and then doing 3 sets to failure, even with the drop sets.
Right. It is possible. If you do 1 set, you're going to get most of the activation. And it's just a process of diminishing returns. So you can do multiple sets. You're potentially going to get a small effect from each of the further sets, but 90-ish% of the effect is going to be from the first set. So, but if you really like to lift weights, no problem. You can still do multiple sets. What I would say is just do multiple sets and then do the last set where you're going to go heavy into failure.
Interesting. And I know you do some interesting, well, it's a cost benefit analysis, or you're kind of trying to do like the most effective training, or some people call it minimal effective dose. Yep. So yeah, what do you do? So
what I do is I usually will go in and I do 1 set to failure. I lift with my wife, she's almost 6 foot tall, like 135, 140 pounds. She's my spotter. She'll lift it up when I can't because I'm getting close. But one thing that you do as you get more experienced as a lifter is you can get to failure quicker, because I can really do the things that I need to do. And one of them is to have constant tension and to not rest while I'm lifting the weight during my set. Because what a lot of people will do whose goal is to lift the weight and just look like you're lifting a lot of weight, is you'll have these periods of time where you're locked out. So you're not really loading, and it's within your set. And what you're going to do is, if you want to go to failure, you're going to continuously keep the tension on the muscle. And so I've gotten really good at that. So what I can do is I can go through my whole body in about 10 to 15 minutes. Where I'm going to go through, I'll do 1 set, I'll push a big muscle, then I'm going to pull so that my pulling muscles are all working while my pushing muscles relax. Then I'm going to push on my next group. So I'll go through and I'll do my chest, back, shoulder, and then I'll do my arms, and then I'll go into my legs, and I'll go through. And it's basically 8 exercises. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes, and it does pretty well.
Yeah. No, I can imagine people don't really believe that. Well, I lift a little longer. I'm lifting like 25 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week, and people don't really believe me. I mean, not like I'm big or anything. I'm not like a huge guy, but still.
I can tell you that what we did at Michigan is that the guys that lift 2 times a week, they'd go maybe 10 to 15 minutes. They'd be in and out in that amount of time. And they were some of the biggest, strongest players in the country.
Wow, yeah, I believe it. And also the form and technique is good too. If you're just trying to get your muscles under that tension, and you're talking about kind of cheating, right? By like resting. It's like if you do the proper form, it's harder. And also, what about doing the reverse slower? Like
exactly.
If you're going down on the bench and you do it slowly, that's better, right?
So basically what you're doing is you're increasing the tension across the muscle. As you decrease the momentum, so as you decrease the velocity of the movement, you increase the work that the muscle has to do. As you increase the velocity, what happens is the elastic parts do more. So your tendon is storing and returning energy, and you're doing it using what muscle physiologists call the series elastic component. So that's where we're going to store and return energy, and we're going to get that back, and we're going to have kind of the bounciness. So if you go over to the bench press and you watch people bench press, a lot of times you'll see people bouncing the weight off their chest. That's great if you want to lift a big weight and look like you're lifting a big weight.
Yeah.
It's not so good if you want to get stronger. And what we do, if we want to get somebody to really focus on improving muscle and tendon health, is that we're just going to increase the weight and make them go slower.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, yeah, you see these people doing like 85%. They're not even doing the full range of motion. They're bouncing. They're doing it really quickly. All these things are just kind of making you look good, but not benefiting you. So it's pretty pointless. So what about lifting every day? I've seen some research on it's better. You're talking about doing a full body workout every single day. Is that better than doing, like, I guess they call it the bro split, where it's like arms day, chest day?
Yeah. So when I lift, I'll lift 1 to 2 times a week. When we lifted at Michigan, it was twice a week. Really, your frequency is dependent on your intensity. So the intensity of the workout that you do every day and the duration of that workout are going to dictate how frequently you can work out. So what I used to also, when I was really young, I was working at a gym, and we had Mr. Canada. He was a bodybuilder. He was Canada's best bodybuilder for a while. And what he would do is his job was to lift weights. And so he would never lift super heavy weights because he had already figured out that he didn't need to do that to get a big muscle. So what he would do is he would lift at a low intensity, so a small percent of his maximum, and he would do long duration. So he'd have long rests in between. He'd go talk to pretty much everybody in the whole gym because that was his life. He loved it.
Yeah.
And so what you do is, if you want to lift more frequently, you just decrease the intensity and the volume of each lift, and now you can work out every day. The guys who do the bro split, where they do upper body, or they'll do, chest and triceps, back and biceps, and then legs, so that they can lift 6 days a week, because one day is chest and tris, and one day is pulls, and one day is the legs. They love being in the gym, and I get it. And it's a great part. And if you've got the time and you've got the ability to do it, totally fine with it. It's not going to be dramatic in your ability to build versus somebody who does the whole body on one day and does it twice a week. You're still lifting that body part twice a week. So it's not really that different. It's just a matter of, you can spend more time. You can enjoy the company of your friends and all of these people in the gym. And if that's what you have and that's what you like, by all means. I barely have time to brush my teeth every day. So I'm trying to minimize the amount of time it takes me to do stuff. And so if I can go really hard in a short period of time, I'm going to go really hard in a short period of time. The only difference between is just the duration, how much time I need to spend there.
Yeah, that's really great. I think that's really important for people to understand. And thank you for telling us about that. And back to leucine-rich protein. So what are leucine-rich protein foods? And
Yeah, so if anybody has questions about it and they want to look up specific foods, you can actually there's a website where you can go, and it just will tell you for 200 kilocalories how much leucine is in the food. But, the leucine-rich proteins are going to be your dairy-based proteins. So your milks and your cheeses and your cottage cheese and your yogurts, those are extremely leucine-rich. You've got your egg protein, and then you've got most of your meat proteins. Most of your meat proteins are leucine-rich protein as well. And then you can find the content of leucine in a number of different vegetables. The issue there is that sometimes the leucine isn't as bioavailable. So you could take a protein like soy protein, which on paper looks like it has good amounts of leucine in it. And when you eat it, digest it, absorb it, if you look at how much gets into your blood, there's less leucine getting into your blood than you would expect based on the leucine content of the protein. And so part of what people are trying to do is they're trying to figure out ways to increase the bioavailability of the leucine and the essential amino acids within certain protein types.
Yeah, well, those plant foods have the bioavailability is always a bit less. Okay, so you talked about longevity and strength. That's really interesting to me. And so I've kind of talked about it before with other doctors and researchers. So what is it about keeping this muscle mass that we think is good for longevity? Because it makes sense to me, but what's going on there?
So there's a whole bunch of different things. There's both metabolic components to it, as well as sociological components to it, as well as just physical components. So the physical component is your activities of daily living. So your ability to get up out of bed, out of a chair, to get into the bath and out of the bath. All of those things that we take for granted when we're young, we see elderly in the population who have a really hard time getting in and out of the bath. They have a really hard time getting up the stairs, in and out of a chair. What that tends to do is it tends to deteriorate the things that you activity level. And as a result, you're going to do less activity. And if you have less activity, you get all of these other effects as well. The second thing is the sociological component of it. The sociological component of it is if you're 80 years old and you're muscly and you look good, everybody comes up to you and say, wow, you look great. Oh, I never guessed you were 80. And they give you all of these compliments that are based on, wow, you look amazing. And if everybody's telling you you look amazing every day, it's got this wonderful effect of making you think that you're amazing. And that's really important as a sociological component. And then the metabolic component is also important because as we age, we lose insulin sensitivity. We lose the ability to really store fuels, to store carbohydrate, to store proteins, to store other fuels that we take in. And that's really important. And the biggest determinant of your basal metabolic rate is your lean body mass, your muscle mass.
Yeah.
So if you have a bigger muscle mass, now you can take in more calories and use them as a fuel. If you're using them as a fuel, you're not storing them as fat. If you're not storing them as fat, you're not increasing your fat mass as much. And the result is that you can maintain your muscle mass, you can maintain your strength, and you can maintain your liver function and your other key functions within your body.
Absolutely. Yeah, that muscle mass will soak up that glucose if you have it, and better insulin sensitivity. That's great. And I think another thing is with older people, they fall. Just having muscle mass is just isn't there some statistic where the biggest cause of something is from falling?
Yeah. So basically, we know that the average longevity after a fall and a broken hip is a year. That's the average length of span of life. So if you can have the ability to maintain your strength, and you can maintain that strength, and it prevents you from falling, or if you do fall, you have enough muscle mass that is able to, in some way that we don't really understand, is able to protect you as you go through rehabilitation. Because if you have a fall and you break something, if you have a bigger muscle mass and you're stronger, your rehabilitation goes faster and you're able to get back to your activities of daily life even faster. And so, there's a number of different ways you can look at it. We know that 30% of people who die of cancer-related disease actually are dying because of the loss in muscle mass and strength that's associated. And I always give the example of my wife's stepdad versus my mentor as a postdoc. So they both had a fall at the same time. They had almost the exact same injuries. They were both they were both in their late 80s at the time. My postdoctoral mentor had been lifting weights up until the week before he had his fall. They both went into intensive care. One of them never came out and was dead within 5 days. And my mentor, who had been lifting weights, got fully recovered, was fully able to return to active lifespan, and lived a number of years after that. And again, That's the difference that happens from this tissue. That's just what its role is to be able to allow you to do the activities that you need to do to survive.
Yeah, that's great. There's so much more on longevity to do with mTOR and IGF-1. And I feel like these things have been so demonized when, we're talking about longevity. But can you talk about what is it called? Rapamycin?
Rapamycin? Yeah. So
So
mTOR is this protein that we know is important for regulating size. So we activate it when we're going to make our muscles bigger, because that's what helps them get bigger. But we're also activating it in other tissues when you've got growth. And so the most obvious condition that's not something that is detrimental to health is going to be cancer. Because cancer, again, it's an uncontrolled growth. And many cancers have elevated mTOR activity. And so one of the ideas is that if you have high mTOR activity, you're going to predispose for cancers. You're going to have all of these other effects that are going to have this potential to shorten lifespan. So one of the best evidence for that is in a number of different animal models, that if you give animals rapamycin, which is a drug that was identified on Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as it's known locally. So it's rapamycin was isolated on Easter Island. And what it is, it's an immunosuppressant, directly blocks mTOR, because mTOR is known as the mechanistic target of rapamycin. So rapamycin binds to this protein and it inhibits its activity. And what we know is that if we give it all of these model organisms rapamycin, what happens is it increases their lifespan. So they live longer. That's been one of the biggest kind of drugs or drug targets for increasing lifespan. And so anything that can decrease global mTOR activity is thought to be something that's really good for longevity. And it makes sense when you think about it, that if we look at other species, like if we look at dogs, we know that a Great Dane, a big, huge dog, is not going to live as long as a little tiny dog like a Dachshund or whatever kind of small dog you have.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is because their size differential was determined because of signaling through the insulin-like growth factor pathway. And one of the main things that it hits is it hits mTOR. And it makes you bigger. If you have more IGF-1 activity, you get bigger. During development, if you have more of that, you're going to get a bigger size. After development, once you're a mature size, then what you want to do is now it's going to be regulated differently. So if you're a small animal, you had very small mTOR activity when you were developing, you, for some reason, are going to live longer. If you're a big animal because you had more mTOR activity during development, you're going to live a shorter lifespan. The interesting thing that happens is once you get past the developmental phase, now we get out to where actually having in humans, if you have more muscle mass or you have more size, once you reach a certain age, that's actually going to increase your likelihood of living a long life. So there's this little difference there. If you have a lot of mTOR activity when you're young, you're going to get big and huge. Any species, the bigger individual within the species is going to have a shorter lifespan. But we think that's because of things that happen during development. Once you're finished development, now what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to activate and inactivate mTOR throughout the rest of our life. And we do that every time we eat, and we do that all through our life through our exercise. But the interesting thing is that not all tissues have the same response. So if I eat a meal, all of my tissues activate mTOR. But if I go out and I exercise, if I go out and I lift weights, or if I go out and I do like a really heavy or hard bicycle exercise training session, what's going to happen is the muscles that I'm activating, if I'm lifting weights, the muscles that I've used to lift weights, I'm going to have this big increase in mTOR activity. But if I look in my liver, if I look in my fat cells, if I look in other cells in my body, what we actually see is that you decrease the activity of mTOR, at least for a short period of time. And that period of time lasts for, a variety of, depending what type of exercise it is. So what we're doing with our exercise is we're turning on mTOR in the tissues we want, and we're turning off mTOR in other tissues. And those are tissues that it's actually not a bad thing to turn off mTOR. And so we're doing that with our exercise, and we can also do that with our diet as well.
That's huge. That's huge. So for one thing, people who want to live longer, they're talking about reducing mTOR as much as possible, or they're doing these like calorie-restricted diets, like extreme calorie deprivation for long periods of time. And it sounds very counterproductive to this.
So it's a bit problematic because in model organisms, calorie restriction does increase lifespan. And there's no doubt about it. If you restrict calories by 20% and you're a mouse or a rat or something else, you're definitely going to have a longer lifespan. There's been some studies in humans where they look at people who are on these caloric restrictive diets, and they can see that markers of health are better in those individuals. But again, that's using classical markers of health. And whether those are predictive of longevity or not are still, we don't know because we haven't done the studies. Because they're really hard to do studies like that in humans because it's hard to track people for 50 years to see what happens over time. And it's obviously not going to come out and, in the type of time period that's going to be important for me if I'm a professor to try and get tenure or to try and improve, my position at my university. So those studies are really, really difficult to do. But having said that, there are definitely advantages to caloric restriction, but if you do, and one of the things that we did in our work, together with John Ramsey and Gino Cortopassi here at UC Davis, is if you put an animal onto a diet and you have the same number of calories, and it's a weight maintenance diet, so they're not increasing their mass over time, but then you start manipulating the macronutrients, the amount of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, you actually can have a really nice substantial change in longevity, even if you're taking in the same number of calories. And so that's where it becomes more interesting to people is because, what we found in humans is that if you are in a study period, people can probably get to about a 10% decrease in caloric, like a caloric restriction of about 10%. The interesting thing that comes from that people get discouraged by, is we know from athletes, if we're in a caloric deficit for a long period of time, we preferentially protect our body fat. And so we end up using more lean mass, and we end up having to do other things to actually try and maintain our mass. So there's really nice studies showing that in gymnasts who are trying to maintain these caloric deficits for a long time, they actually have much higher body fat than other athletes that aren't in a caloric deficit.
Well,
And most athletes and most nutritionists who work with athletes can tell you that when they put people onto a caloric, they match their calories much better, and they're no longer in a caloric energy deficit, you'll actually find that people drop body fat when that happens. At least the athletes do. Even though they're taking in more calories, they're actually seeing they drop body fat. And it's strictly because when you're in an energy deficit chronically, it tends to be something where you lose lean mass more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think we should be doing this calorie restriction thing at all. And your body, it protects itself, and it has like a set point that it wants to be at, and it's bad to try to go below that, I think. And what was that ratio? So you're talking about the different ratios of protein and carbs and fat in the study.
So in the studies done in mice, because we're looking at longevity, and so the study is only going to take about 3 years to do instead of what it would take in a human. What we do is take mice at 12 months old when they've all been on the same diet, and then we kept some on that same diet, and then we did what's just a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which is we dropped the carbohydrate content to very, very low carbohydrate, and basically the diet was predominantly fat with a relatively high amount of protein. And that's important because in rodents, they make carbohydrates really well. Mm-hmm. So if I have a rat or a mouse and I put them onto a diet that has no carbohydrate in it, but I give them 15% of their diet as protein, they'll take a lot of that protein and they'll make glucose really effectively. Mm-hmm. So then what we have to do in order to make it so, as a result, they don't generate any ketones when they're doing that. And so if we want them to go into a ketogenic state, what we have to do is we have to decrease their protein content as well. So we give them still a sufficient protein content so that they're not in a protein deficit. But when you go into these diets that are, say, 90 to 95% fat and 5-ish% protein, there's enough protein to be at what in humans would be the recommended daily allowance.
Yeah.
And so those were the three groups. And what we saw was that in the low carbohydrate, high fat group, they had about a 6% improvement in longevity. It wasn't statistically significant. And then in the ketogenic group, where we dropped the protein a little bit more, what we found is that there was about a 13.5% improvement in longevity. And that was just showing that in these mice, if you get onto a ketogenic diet, you can increase longevity. And in the same issue of the journal that we published in, there was another group out of UCSF, Eric Verdon's group. And what they did is they did intermittent ketogenic diets. So they would do it for I think it was a week on, a week off, the ketogenic diet, and they saw a similar improvement in longevity. So it was really interesting insofar as what seems to be obvious is that these ketogenic diets and low carbohydrate diets tend to have this ability to increase longevity in rodent models.
Yeah, so two things, obvious questions. Does it translate to humans, and why do you think it does that? Lowers mTor?
Yeah, so again, in order to activate mTor, there's two signals that you need. One is from the amino acids, and specifically leucine and arginine are two amino acids that will activate mTor. The other signal that activates mTor is going to come from one of two places. You can either get it from exercise, or you can get it from insulin signaling. And so if you're going to get it dietarily, that means that you can get a little bit of insulin from your protein intake. But if you have the carbohydrate, it's going to give you greater insulin response, and that's going to increase the amount of, or the activity of mTOR to a higher degree. So one of the things that we think is happening on a ketogenic diet is that when there's lower carbohydrate, we're not getting as much of an insulin response to a meal, and as a result, we only get one signal to mTOR, so we don't get as much mTOR activity in tissues that you don't exercise, such as your liver, your adipose, your kidney, all of these other areas. So globally, what we see in these models is on a ketogenic diet, there's a lower mTOR activity at baseline around the body. So if you look at it, there's less mTOR activity. And so that could either be that there's less insulin signaling, or it could be that there's less of an inflammatory signal. Because as I said, rapamycin, the drug that blocks mTOR, it goes against the inflammatory system. So it's an anti-rejection drug. What it does is it works on the immune system. It's possible that a ketogenic diet maybe is decreasing global inflammation, and that's having this effect of within the tissue, you're just not seeing as much mTOR activity. So we haven't really figured out whether the decrease in mTOR activity is within the cells of the tissue or because there's fewer inflammatory cells there. It could be one of those two things that's doing that.
So you're talking about different things that activate mTOR or for protein synthesis. So it's either you're lifting weights, you're having an insulin spike, or what's the third one? And there's different combinations. I know that.
Right. So, So two things add up. It's the amino acids have to be there. So that's one signal that has to be there. So the leucine or protein component. The other signal can either come from your resistance exercise or from your insulin IGF-1 signal. So if you're on a ketogenic diet and you're getting maybe a little bit less of the inflammatory signal, or maybe you're getting less insulin, you're still going to get enough insulin response to the meal to activate it to get mTOR acutely within the muscle. Or if you do resistance exercise, you get a really big stimulus for mTOR activation because now you've activated it together with the amino acids, you're activating it with your resistance exercise. Now you've got a really big signal for mTOR in your skeletal muscle. But again, that's not a signal you would see in your liver, your kidneys, and other tissues. And so the big thing for all of the rodent studies that we've done is that rodents tend to die from cancer. And so 8 out of 10 of the animals who were on our controlled diet, 8 out of 10 animals died. Their cause of death was a cancer. When we did the necropsy on the animals that were on the ketogenic diet, we found that only 2 of the animals on the ketogenic diet died from cancer, from overt cancer. And so really the ketogenic diet seems to be really, really effective at decreasing the likelihood of cancer. And that we think is down to its ability to decrease global mTOR activity. We like the idea of doing that with a diet because, as I said, rapamycin can increase longevity. But in humans, there's at least one study that's shown in older humans, when you have an old person and they're taking rapamycin, what happens is that they lose muscle mass faster than somebody who's not taking rapamycin. Because nobody's feeding us the way that we feed our animals, where it's just right there and we don't have to move. And we still have to get around our environment. We still have to do things. If we're not doing those things effectively, then we're going to have problems with longevity. In these rodents, one of the biggest things is, look, if we can decrease cancer rate, that's great. Rapamycin does that. If the rapamycin also causes a loss in muscle mass, that's okay. The difference in humans is we need the muscle mass in order to have that long life. So what we'd like to do in the humans is maybe use a ketogenic diet to keep mTOR activity low. But then if we need to mount an immune response, or if we want to lift weights and grow our muscle bigger, now what we'll get is we can still turn on mTOR when we want to turn it on. And that's really what we think is beneficial about these diets, is that what it does is it keeps the baseline low, and it doesn't take away the ability to turn on the pathway. So if we exercise, if we have if we get sick, if we're taking rapamycin, we're not going to be able to respond to that as well.
Yeah, rapamycin is like this blanket thing that hits all cells, but we want something with like a diet or with the exercise that is tissue specific.
Exactly, so that you can have a tissue specific effect to build your muscle. You can have a tissue specific effect to mount an immune response. You can have other tissue specific effects where we don't even know yet that rapamycin is important for those, or that mTOR is important for those. We know that mTOR is also important for learning and memory. In the brain, you need to be able to activate it. So it's entirely possible that if you're taking mTOR or inhibitors like rapamycin, that maybe you're not able to learn or form memories as well.
Yeah.
So there's other things that we don't even know yet about some of the drug components that we don't think are problems in the dietary manipulations, because if the dietary manipulation is keeping the baseline low, but then you have a signal, say you've got a growth factor release in the brain that's going to be important for learning and remembering what you just did, that can still happen in the presence of a restrictive diet. It can't happen if there's a drug there that's going to prevent that.
Yeah. And then back to insulin too. So you're talking about carbohydrates. So I know a lot of weightlifters, it's all based around carbohydrates, and they're eating frequent meals and they always want to spike that insulin. So is it still equally as possible to do that without carbohydrates, or do you need those to gain muscle?
Yeah, there's no real need for carbohydrate in order to gain muscle. Some of the earliest things that were done research-wise to show that protein was important. There was a study, and it was in older individuals by Michael Kerr. And Michael Kerr is out of Denmark. And what he did is he gave people right after, and these were old people, so he gave them leucine-rich protein right after they lifted weights. And if he gave it to them right after they lifted weights, they did better than if he waited 2 hours and gave them the same protein. And then he did a follow-up study where he gave them the same number of calories right after, but those calories came from carbohydrate. And what he found is that the carbohydrate group had no effect. There was no effect of the carbohydrate on building muscle, whereas the protein was able to increase the protein accumulation in muscle. So again, we know that if you're lifting a weight for a period of time after you've lifted weights, looks like about 30 minutes to 3 hours, you're actually becoming insulin resistant, because the lifting of weights has turned on this pathway, which is a feedback pathway that shuts down the ability of insulin to increase protein synthesis. And again, this is one of the molecular breaks that we talk about, that I've talked about before, in that what it's doing is, what we think is happening is that you're getting this, basically it's a system that's designed to limit the increase in muscle mass that would happen as a result of the exercise. You can think of reasons why that would be evolutionarily, because evolutionarily, if muscle mass is the most metabolically active tissue, if you build a lot of muscle mass and then you go back through a period of famine, you have the potential to die quicker because you have to feed this mass and you need more calories. So if calories are limiting in our evolution, it makes sense that you don't want to build a lot of muscle mass really easily, because then you're going to, at the next period of scarcity, you're going to deteriorate much faster.
Well, this is this concept of antagonistic pleiotropy, which is like what's good for you now could be bad later. And so kind of combining all the stuff you've been talking about is, what is the optimal way to do things? Because it feels like if you get too big, too much muscle, or maybe people who grow too much, like you're saying, when you're younger, it could be bad for longevity. And maybe I don't think you see a lot of like 7-footers living till they're 100, or these gigantic muscle, bound weightlifters living till 100. I mean, that could be from different reasons of steroids they've been taking or something. But what is the balance of all this?
That's a great question, and it's something that we don't really have good science for yet. What we know is that if you have a smaller body frame from development, you're going to live longer. The longest lived mouse that hadn't had any kind of caloric restriction or anything was a growth hormone deficient mouse. The researcher called it Yoda, and what it was is because Yoda was tiny little mouse. He couldn't produce enough heat to keep himself warm, so they always gave him a younger mouse that would live with him and snuggle up to the younger mouse, and that would help keep him warm, and that increased. And he ended up living almost to 4 years old. So just really long lived. But again, small animal. We think that that's really important developmentally. So if you have, during development, if you have a stimulus to grow big, shorter lifespan. If you don't have that stimulus, you're going to have a longer lifespan. Once you get to your mature size, what we really focus on and what we try and tell people to focus on is we want them to focus on strength. Because as we said, strength doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be huge. And what we really focus on is strength relative to your size. So it's strength relative to your own body mass. So if you can do body mass-based exercises, and there's a really nice study that showed that if you could do 40 push-ups, you had this big difference in longevity outcome. And again, it's just this idea of the reason that we need muscle is so that we can do our activities. You don't need to be able to lift. You don't
need Schwarzenegger to do activities.
Exactly. You don't need to be able to bench press 225 pounds for lots of repetitions if you weigh 70, 80, 90 pounds. If you weigh 225 pounds, maybe that's important. But if you're a smaller individual, you need to be strong for people your size. So we really focus on strength because that's the key component. And you can do that relative to your body size relatively easily. Muscle mass is important. We like to keep it up, but we don't try and drive it to the extent that you have just a huge, huge body mass. Is there a sweet spot where you've got the optimal strength for your size? It is entirely possible. There is not a shred of evidence that we have yet as to what that point is.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, it's hard. So with longevity still, there's other people like Walter Longo or some of these more plant-based people that are trying to say that eating meat is bad for longevity, and they're just talking about mTor and you don't want to spike all this IGF-1, that kind of thing. So for one thing, doesn't eating like sugar and these sort of processed carbs or maybe high glycemic foods raise IGF-1 more than protein? And what are your thoughts on just protein and mTor and longevity?
So again, just like with the ketogenic diet, there are low protein diets in rodents do increase longevity. Again, because what we talked about with the mTOR components is that amino acids are fundamentally essential to being able to turn on mTOR. If you don't have enough amino acid, you're not going to turn on mTOR. mTOR is important in cancer. Cancer is going to kill 8 out of 10 mice. If we have lower global mTOR because you have low protein, you're probably going to increase longevity. Now, having said that, again, just like in human, you need the protein mass, you need your muscle mass in order to be a functioning human. You need your strength. For people who say, that you shouldn't take in protein, that is what it does is it actually accelerates muscle wasting in older individuals. So we know that if you're as you get older, you actually need more protein in order to activate the same pathways. So there's a beautiful study by Dan Moore looking at how much protein it takes to fully increase muscle protein synthesis in young. And that's about 0.24 grams per kilogram body weight. They do the exact same study in older people, and it goes up to about 0.4 grams per kilogram body weight. What that means is that in order to maintain your muscle mass, you need to have protein within your diet, and you need to have, as an older person, you need to have more protein.
You're less efficient in a way.
You are less efficient. Digestion and absorption goes down. Your acidity of your stomach goes down. All kinds of things that could contribute to it. And again, if you're going to do it from plant-based proteins, that's fine. If you're going to do it from one of my colleagues in Holland, he's doing a lot of studies with grubs and with insect-based proteins. If it's about environmental reasons to decrease protein intake or decrease meat intake, okay, there's a place for that. But then you have to have a substitute that's going to give you a functional protein. As we talked about earlier, some of the plant-based proteins, the bioavailability of the protein is lower. So that's one really interesting possible area of research, is to increase the bioavailability of plant-based proteins to make them equivalent to a whey-based protein or a meat-based protein. That would be really good. That would be great. Or to use less environmentally costly protein sources, meat-based sources like the stuff that's coming from bugs. Because we know that people aren't going to be too big into it, but if you're just going to freeze dry your protein anyways, Luc Van Loon's got a nice study where he looks at all these different larvae and he compares them and how much muscle protein synthesis do you get from different bug larvae. And you definitely see it going into your muscle and becoming part of who you are. And so if it's just about environmental reasons, there's other ways that you can get protein. But again, I'm a muscle biologist. I think that protein is important for muscle function. It's hard for me to say, oh yeah, a low protein diet. I know that it increases. I know it increases longevity, but I also think there might be some problems associated with it in people.
Well, yeah, I think could be problems with those studies too. Is we can't really have hard outcomes on this and know that be sure that in humans low protein is good for longevity anyway. So also, I sort of push back on the environmental aspects too. That's a totally different story. I think we can raise beef in a perfectly actually beneficial way to the environment if we do it correctly. But then I do appreciate the insect protein, because I think that can be done at a less cost and to the environment as well. But what about collagen protein? So collagen is huge, and I know you've done a lot of studies on that, and I'm really interested in it lately as well. I mean, I'm really interested in nose to tail eating, and eating the bone marrow and bone broth and getting this collagen. I think it's important to get that full amino acid profile and get all the things that our ancestors ate. And ever since I've been drinking a lot of bone broth or taking collagen, I've noticed great things in my joints and wound healing and stuff like that. I mean, I'm training for a decathlon, which I have some questions about later, about some athletic questions. But I had to pull out of a decathlon because I kind of tore something in my leg. I couldn't even walk. 9 days later, I played basketball. Yeah. And I attribute it to taking all this collagen and, eating a good diet. So let's talk about collagen.
Yeah. So collagen is, in any animal, it's going to be the most common protein in the body. So it's the most common protein, and it makes all of the connective tissues. So it makes up your skin, the predominant protein in your skin. It's the predominant protein in your hair. Well, in a lot of different tissues, it's going to make the arteries and the capillaries. It is the protein that's going to be the thing that's really common in all of these. It's going to form the backbone of your bones. Mm-hmm. So it is the most common protein in your body. And so it's unique protein as well, because it has a mechanical role. Because it has a mechanical role, it forms these helical structures. So these are like those staircases that are the little tiny staircases that go up in a spiral staircase. Mm-hmm. So it's got to form these really tight spirals. And the way that it does this is it uses the smallest amino acid, which is glycine, and it rotates the protein around that so that it can pack in really densely. And so that gives the strength to a lot of our tissues. And so as a result, in collagen, the protein, every third amino acid is a glycine. And then there's two other amino acids that are really common in it, and that's proline and lysine. These amino acids are highly enriched in this protein. It's very low in most of the other amino acids. So you're not going to find a lot of leucine in collagen. So it shouldn't be that great for building muscle mass. Mm-hmm. But if you have every third amino acid as a glycine, if you're taking in a whey protein, what some researchers are finding is that when you take in whey protein, actually the glycine content of the blood goes down, and it's possible that certain amino acids could become rate limiting. It's just a possibility that hasn't been completely tested at this point. When we started this, and the reason that we got into it is experimentally in the laboratory, we were engineering ligaments. So these are human ligaments we make them in a dish. They're three-dimensional, and we can test their mechanical function. We can test their strength. What we were doing is we were growing them up, and what we realized is that the media didn't have certain amino acids at a high level, and one of them was proline. We added extra proline in, and suddenly our ligaments got a lot stronger. And we added in ascorbic acid or vitamin C, and also you got a really, really big effect, because you need vitamin C, you need ascorbic acid to make collagen. You can't make and export collagen if you don't have vitamin C.
That's huge, because I know you did a study too that kind of show that, or that people, you didn't even realize that before when you're taking collagen without it or something.
Yeah, so people have realized that vitamin C is essential for collagen synthesis for almost 300 years. So it's the first nutritional study was done on people with scurvy, and that was this disease that sailors would get because they didn't have any access to fresh fruits and vegetables as well as meats. And so the result was that they would get scurvy. And so when they gave them like a lemon or a lime, you could reverse the effects, and you could basically reverse scurvy in a matter of days. And so we've known that it's important, but what we noticed is that when we did some studies, we always had vitamin C there, and we would just add it in a juice that we were using to dissolve the gelatin that we used. So we'd give them gelatin, people would swirl it around and drink it, and then we'd measure amino acid appearance in the blood, and then we'd measure how much collagen was synthesized. And that's really difficult to measure because it's a pretty stable thing in most people. What we like to do with the collagen is we have to give some sort of a stimulus to the system, because normally we're going to make lots of collagen around the body. And it's hard for us to detect when we make more or less, just because there's such a big background. And so what we did is we give them a short period of jump rope as a way to stimulate the bones to start producing more collagen. And when we did that, what we saw is that if we gave an increasing dose of collagen, what we saw is that we got an increasing amount of collagen protein synthesis in the body. So we would be able to take out the blood and measure, we can tell that there's more collagen synthesis. But the even more interesting thing to me was that if we take out the blood an hour after you eat a gelatin and vitamin C, or a hydrolyzed collagen and vitamin C, and we put it onto our engineered ligaments, what we find is that our engineered ligaments become bigger, they have more collagen, and they're stronger from baseline, when you had no vitamin C and no collagen, to an hour after you've had vitamin C and collagen. And what that's really telling us is that something that you're eating is directly affecting the ability of your body to provide the amino acids necessary to make new collagen. What we don't know for a fact yet is whether it's any protein will do, because we haven't tested it against whey protein, for example, just to see if all we're doing is increasing amino acids and that's making us synthesize more protein. If we go in and we give an equal amount of protein as whey protein or as gelatin or hydrolyzed collagen, is there still a beneficial effect of the collagen? Because what we're looking to answer is, does it need to be this specific protein, or is it just any protein? So that still needs to be done, but there's some encouraging work that's out there.
That's interesting. And I know people listening might know that liver has vitamin C in it, and I think bone marrow naturally has some vitamin C in it. So if you're eating bone marrow, you are getting a bit of vitamin C in there, and that will be enough to drive the collagen synthesis. You only need about 15 grams, I believe.
It's 50 milligrams.
50 milligrams, that's what.
But remember, if you're going to be doing those things, as soon as you cook it, it's going to kill it. So that's the experiment we did, where we tried to make the gummy. And when we made the gummy, we boiled the juice. The boiling of the juice killed the vitamin C, and we didn't get any collagen synthesis in that group that had the gummy. It's very sensitive to light. It's very sensitive to heat. So vitamin C is really inactivated quite readily. So that's where you have to be a little bit worried about it. So I don't know. I can't honestly tell you how much vitamin C there is in a fresh meat, but I can tell you that once you cook it so that it's relatively cooked, I think that it's going to be a bit problematic for the vitamin C content. But again, I haven't looked at it directly, so I don't know what the vitamin C content of a steak that has been heated medium rare would be.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, some people are eating raw liver to get the vitamin C, so that would be good. And then also, you're talking about boiling. What if you had, a collagen powder, if you just warmed it up with some ascorbic acid to get that vitamin C? Any idea how warm you could make it without destroying it?
The thing with hydrolyzed collagen is that you can put it into a cool beverage because it's hydrolyzed, it doesn't form a gel, so it's easier to dissolve. What people will do is, if they want to take in something like a collagen or a gelatin, what a lot of people will do is they'll do something where they'll have the collagen powder and they'll get it with some orange juice, or they'll get it with something else that has vitamin C. If you don't do orange juice, you can do 6 strawberries will have enough vitamin C type of thing. So it's not a lot of vitamin C. You just need to have something that's going to provide you the cofactor that's going to make it possible for your body to make collagen.
Okay, that's good to know. I'm so interested in those experiments. It's so cool. I know you're using muscles to power machinery.
Yeah, so that's something that we did when I was a postdoc at Michigan. That's where we started looking at tendon, because we had been given grants to try and make a self-repairing motor is how we termed it. So muscle is a self-repairing motor. So the idea is if you don't have a lot of opportunity to repair something, you need to have motors that can fix themselves. And so we had talked about biological motors and self-repairing motors. But every time you would try and put one of these motors or these engineered muscles onto a machine to make it go, they would always fail at the interface between the machine and the motor. And that's where we started studying how a tendon works, because that's what the tendon's job is. The tendon's job is to protect the muscle from injury as it pulls on something that's really stiff, like a machine or like a bone. Mm-hmm. So that's really where we started doing that research.
And then you found what is it with this S6 kinase, and that it's you found this 99% correlation.
Yeah, that's the mTOR activity. That's how we measure mTOR activity. So after resistance exercise, the S6 kinase phosphorylation, it correlates with muscle hypertrophy because that's the marker that mTOR has been turned on. The complex 1 of mTOR has been turned on. So what we used it for is just as a marker to see how much activity we got from mTOR. And that's, as we talked about before, that was the kind of the key finding from the early work was that as you increased mTOR activity, you got a bigger muscle over time.
Okay. Well, I just have a few more things. So I mentioned this sprinting and decathlon and that kind of thing. Do you have enough glycogen in your body to do these quick exercises? And do you need carbohydrates to do that? I know that some people do distance, ultra marathons, and they do fine on fat adapted, running. But if you're trying to sprint, isn't there enough glycogen in your muscles to give you enough to do a sprint?
So for a sprint, you would be using glycogen and you'd be using ATP and phosphocreatine. So it's not about whether there's enough glycogen to do it. So one of the interesting things that was found, actually, Tim Noakes, who's a big proponent of low carbohydrate, high fat diet. One of the early studies that he did was he fat adapted cyclists, and they could do just fine, as you said, on the longer runs or on the longer rides. What he did is he had within that, just like you would have in a race, is he had a few sprints built in. And what he found is that the people who were fat adapted always performed less well on the sprint. And the reason they perform less well on the sprint is in order to sprint, you need to generate energy quickly. We generate energy most quickly through, once our ATP and phosphocreatine have started to be depleted, we generate it most quickly through glycolysis, which just uses sugar, and then from using sugar and processing it using oxidative energy. And so what he found is that other people have since repeated is you can do really well at endurance. It's much harder to sprint super fast. And the reason is that when you fat adapt, what you do is you activate a transcription factor that is important in increasing fat oxidation enzymes, which is great. And then what our muscles do is they're choosing to use either fat or carbohydrate for energy. And if you've adapted to using fat, you've decreased your ability to use carbohydrate. And so what that ends up doing is it ends up decreasing the rate at which you can produce energy to sprint. And so the reason that fat adapted individuals can't sprint as fast is just because our body is preferentially adapted to use fat as a fuel. When we do that preferential adaptation, fat needs to go through two cycles in order to make energy, makes a ton more energy than carbohydrate, all of these great things. But because it has to go through two cycles, it has to go through a bunch of transporters, we just can't make energy as quickly. And so if it's one sprint, you might be able to do it fine. But if it's a repeated sprint, that's when you'd get into a bit of problem.
What if you just target carbs around that event?
So that's the way that they tried to do it for a while. You can replenish the glycogen, but the thing that doesn't go away as quickly is that what you do in order to preferentially use fat is you turn on a gene called phosphodehydrogenase kinase. You don't need to know that, but what that does is it phosphorylates the protein that takes sugar and brings it into the mitochondria. And when it's phosphorylated, it doesn't work as well. And so what the evidence shows is that you can, even if you were to replenish your glycogen completely for 3 or 4 days of carbohydrate-rich diet before competing, you still can't use the carbohydrate as well, simply because in the process of becoming fat adapted, you've turned on that gene, and now you just can't get carbohydrate through into the system. What I don't know is how long you'd have to go for before you get that back, because that's really what you're looking for. And what I think you're asking is, can we do all of these adaptations? We get the fat adaptation, all good. And then we get, on top of fat adaptation, we get back the ability to use carbs as a fuel. There isn't enough data out there to tell us how long that takes. But the biggest study ever done on kind of the low carbohydrate, high fat diet in performance was called Supernova 2, and now Supernova 3. And this is using 50-kilometer race walkers, because that would be the group that probably could use fat as a fuel, because they're not going super, super fast, and they're going a long time. So that should be the group that the sports scientists thought was going to be the most likely to see a beneficial effect. They actually didn't see the beneficial effect during the training period where they were either on a carbohydrate rich or a carbohydrate poor diet. But one of the interesting things that they found is that because these were all Olympic level athletes, the study was over and they went back to their own training, and they went back to having their own diet. A lot of the individuals after this big training camp, when they were either using fat or not, they actually found that they had a performance record or personal best in the period after. And so one of the possibilities was that, okay, it's not good to be completely fat adapted, but if you do this for a while and then you go back and you do your normal diet, and then there's a performance benefit.
Interesting. So you're kind of more metabolically flexible. Maybe you got that fat burning capability, but then you got a little more adapted to carbs, and then that was the benefit.
Potentially. But the other explanation could be that you're in a group of the world's best athletes at your event, because that's what they did. They got people from all over the world who are the national or international level race walkers. And so you're training in this incredible group. You're a little bit overtrained during the training because you're trying to compete with the best in the world. And then when you go back and you have time to recover, now you perform better. So there's two possibilities there, and I think the data is coming out as to whether one is more likely than the other.
All right. Well, I had one more thing. I know you have some interesting stuff with elderly and dystrophin and muscle recovery and wasting.
Yeah, so what we had done in rodent models, again, where we can take lots of muscle out and we can figure out what's going on, what we found is that over a lifespan, rat muscles tend to lose the protein dystrophin. So there's two interesting things that we found, is that in our weight-bearing muscles, there was higher dystrophin than our non-weight-bearing muscles. So like in our calf and our quad, we would have more dystrophin than in our shin muscle and our hamstring muscle. And one of the things that we and other groups had found is that if you have epicatechin-rich cocoa, so natural chocolate, what you can do is, as older individuals, you increase the amount of dystrophin and other force transfer proteins within the muscle, and it makes the muscle more resistant to exercise-induced injury. And so that's a simple nutritional way that you can go in, you can manipulate this microRNA, you can increase the dystrophin in your muscle, and when you do that, you can increase the robustness of your muscle.
That's amazing. And this is just any natural chocolate? Like what kind of?
So natural cocoa that hasn't been Dutch processed.
So what is Dutch processing?
So Dutch processing is when you use an alkali to make the chocolate darker and richer looking. So if baking chocolate is almost always like in cocoa, when you do baking cocoa, that's almost always been Dutch processed. So you're looking for the stuff that's a little bit more gray than dark brown color. And that's the natural chocolate.
Well, I'm an aging athlete, so I think I need to look into that. Well, I know you got to go. Thank you so much. So many amazing things here. And I'm glad there's guys like you doing this research. This is really great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It was good to be here. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Bye. Man, I wish I could have talked to Keith longer. Maybe I'll catch up with him in the future. Don't forget to get your tickets to the special event in Toronto on nosethetail.org/event. And also check out the awesome grass-finished meat we're selling there. Have you rated or reviewed this podcast on iTunes or your podcast app yet? If not, it's the freest and easiest way to support me. You can still get a copy of the Food Lies film on Indiegogo, and you can still follow Food Lies on social media where a lot is going on daily. Check out all the new highlight pieces on some of the experts interviewed for the film on YouTube. And until next time, eat densely and move intensely, my friends.